Wow, my son-in-law laughed, lifting his glass. I guess some people just never grow out of being irrelevant. The table went quiet for half a second. Just long enough for everyone to hear it. Then a few uncomfortable chuckles followed, like static after a bad joke. I felt my face burn as he smiled at me, not apologetic, not embarrassed, pleased. Like he'd landed the punchline exactly where he wanted. This wasn't new. That was the worst part. Every family dinner, every holiday, every gathering, he found a way. A comment about how I wouldn't understand modern business. A joke about my age. A casual remark about how times were different back then whenever I offered an opinion. Always said lightly. Always wrapped in humor. Always with an audience. I looked around the table. My daughter stared down at her plate. My husband shifted in his chair. Someone changed the subject too quickly. No one said a word. He leaned back, satisfied, like a man who knew exactly how much he could get away with. I forced a smile. I always did. Years of swallowing it had taught me how. But something inside me finally clicked, not anger, not yet, something colder. This wasn't teasing. This was power. And he loved using it on me because he was absolutely certain of one thing: I would never fight back. It didn't start that way. Or maybe it did, and I just didn't want to see it. At first, his comments were small. Easy to dismiss. A raised eyebrow when I spoke. A sarcastic, "That's one way to look at it," said with a smirk. The kind of things that make you question whether you're being too sensitive. That was his favorite trick: never cross a line clearly enough to be called out. But patterns don't need volume to be obvious. They repeat. He interrupted me constantly, finishing my sentences with a distorted version of what I'd actually said. When I tried to correct him, he'd laugh and say, "Relax, I'm kidding." When I stayed quiet, he'd interpret that as permission. The jokes evolved. He started using me as an example of what not to be. Outdated. Out of touch. Someone who meant well but didn't quite belong in the room. And every time, he made sure others were listening. What hurt most wasn't him. It was how smoothly everyone adapted. Conversations kept going around me instead of with me. If I spoke, I slid past. If I fell silent, no one noticed. The message was subtle but clear: my discomfort was less important than keeping things pleasant. He noticed that too. Once, when I didn't react at all, he smiled at me across the table and said, "See? She knows I'm right." No one challenged him. That's when I realized this wasn't about humor or personality. It was rehearsal. And he was getting better at it every time. People always ask why you don't say something sooner. As if silence means consent. The truth is quieter than that. I stayed silent because I was tired of being the problem. Every time I even hinted that his comments bothered me, the room shifted, not toward him, but toward me. Faces tightened. Someone sighed. Someone else said, "Let's not make this awkward." So I learned to absorb it. I told myself I was being mature. That I didn't need validation. That family peace mattered more than my pride. I convinced myself that reacting would only give him what he wanted: attention, conflict, control. And maybe that was true. But endurance has a cost. I started choosing my words carefully, then not choosing them at all. I sat back. I laughed when everyone else laughed. I edited myself in advance so he wouldn't have material. It became second nature, shrinking just enough to be ignored, but not enough to disappear. What I didn't realize at the time was how closely he was watching. Every swallowed reaction taught him where the limits were. Every forced smile confirmed he was untouchable. He learned that I valued harmony more than dignity, and he used that knowledge expertly. The family called it keeping the peace. He called it winning, and I kept telling myself it was temporary. That eventually someone would notice. That surely it couldn't go on forever. I was wrong. Because the longer I stayed silent, the bolder he became. And the next thing he did made it clear this wasn't just personal anymore. The first time I finally said something out loud, it wasn't even dramatic. I waited until the dishes were cleared and the room had thinned out. I told my daughter, gently, that the way he spoke to me hurt. I chose my words carefully, no accusations, no anger. Just honesty. She looked uncomfortable immediately. He doesn't mean it like that, she said. That's just how he jokes. Others chimed in quickly, like they'd rehearsed it. You know how he is. He's just blunt. You're taking it too personally. No one asked him to stop. Instead, they explained me to myself. Too sensitive, from a different generation. Not used to his sense of humor. They framed my discomfort as a misunderstanding rather than a boundary being crossed. And then came the most effective line of all. Do you really want to cause tension in the family over this? That's how it worked. The responsibility for peace landed squarely on my shoulders, while his behavior stayed untouched. I was expected to adjust, soften, endure, because it was easier than asking him to change. He noticed the shift immediately. After that, he stopped pretending. The jokes got sharper. The pauses after them got longer. He looked around the room before delivering them, confident no one would interrupt. Once, after a particularly cruel remark, he glanced at my daughter and said, smiling, "See? She's fine," and everyone nodded. That was the moment I understood something painful but clarifying. He wasn't bold because he was brave. He was bold because he was protected. And that protection made him dangerous. Once he realized no one would stop him, he stopped testing the waters. The jokes became pointed. Personal. Less disguised. He started telling stories where I was the punchline, exaggerating my words, twisting my reactions, framing me as clueless or needy. And he told them loudly, with confidence, like facts everyone already agreed on. At one dinner, I corrected him on a detail he got wrong. Nothing dramatic. Just a sentence. He leaned forward, smiled, and said, "This is why we don't let her handle important things." The room laughed. Not hard, but enough. Something shifted then, not in me, in him. He began interrupting on purpose. Cutting me off mid-sentence. Mocking my opinions before I finished expressing them. Once, he raised his hand and said, "Hold on, let her finish, this should be good." Like I was entertainment. I noticed how carefully he chose his moments. Never alone. Always with witnesses. Always when I was already cornered by politeness. He wanted me embarrassed, not angry. Ashamed, not confrontational. And the more I withdrew, the more space he took. What frightened me wasn't the cruelty. It was the precision. He knew exactly how far to go without triggering intervention. He knew how to make me look small without raising his voice. At a family gathering, someone asked why I'd gone quiet lately. Before I could answer, he said, "She's just finally learned her place." No one corrected him. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even replay the words in my head. I did something else. For the first time, I started watching him, not emotionally, but closely. And what I noticed made me uneasy. Once I stopped reacting, I started noticing details I'd ignored for years. The way his confidence slipped when the conversation turned specific. How he spoke in broad claims but avoided follow-up questions. How quickly he redirected attention when someone pressed him for numbers, timelines, proof. One evening, a friend of his mentioned a deal he'd supposedly closed. Just casually, like it was common knowledge. My son-in-law laughed it off and changed the subject so abruptly it felt rehearsed. No one questioned it. I did. Another time, he bragged about a promotion that hadn't happened yet, said it like it already had. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. When someone asked again, he blamed corporate delays and rolled his eyes, like the question itself was naive. The moment that stayed with me happened at a family gathering. He mocked me for being behind the times and then, not 5 minutes later, asked someone else to explain a concept I'd worked with professionally for years. He listened carefully. Too carefully. That was when the humiliation started to feel performative. Like distraction. I realized something unsettling. He needed the room focused on me so no one would look too closely at him. Every joke bought him cover. Every laugh redirected attention. Every time I shrank, his position felt more secure. People who are truly untouchable don't need to humiliate others to prove it. That thought stayed with me long after the dinner ended. I didn't know what his secret was yet. But I knew this much: he wasn't as solid as he pretended to be, and once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. I didn't confront him. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I went quiet in a different way. Not the shrinking kind, the listening kind. I stopped filling silences. Stopped explaining myself. I let conversations unfold without stepping in to soften them. And in that space, things surfaced. He contradicted himself often. Stories shifted depending on who was listening. Dates moved. Numbers rounded conveniently. He relied heavily on confidence, not consistency. I noticed how carefully he managed impressions. He spoke first when new people were around, dominated the room early, before anyone could ask questions. If someone challenged him, even lightly, he'd laugh and redirect, turning it into a joke at their expense. Once, I asked an innocent question. Just one. His jaw tightened before he smiled. He answered vaguely, then spent the rest of the evening making small digs at me, as if to reassert control. That reaction told me everything. People with nothing to hide don't retaliate over curiosity. I started paying attention to how others responded to him when he wasn't performing. A few avoided eye contact. Some nodded without enthusiasm. One person once said, under their breath, "He talks a big game." The humiliation hadn't stopped, but it no longer landed the same. It felt like noise, not truth. I wasn't internalizing it anymore. I was mapping it. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Not just in how he treated me, but in what he desperately needed others not to notice. I still didn't know what his secret was, but I knew where to look. And I knew that when it surfaced, it wouldn't need my help. It would speak for itself. I didn't find his secret by digging. I found it by noticing what didn't add up. It started with a name I'd heard before. Not from him, from someone else. A former colleague mentioned it casually, in a completely unrelated conversation. When I asked where they knew it from, they paused. Wasn't that connected to him? They said it like a question. Like something everyone assumed was true but no one had verified. That night, I went home and followed the thread. Public records. Old announcements. Archived pages that hadn't been updated in years. The kind of information that sits in plain sight because no one thinks to look. The story he told and the facts on paper didn't match. Titles he claimed didn't exist. Achievements that had been overstated, then repeated until they sounded real. A timeline that only worked if you didn't examine it too closely. His success wasn't fabricated entirely, but it was padded, rearranged, and carefully framed to hide how unstable it actually was. And then I saw it, the gap. A period he never talked about. A project that ended abruptly. A quiet exit that had been dressed up as a strategic move. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just failure, concealed and rewritten. I sat there longer than I meant to, staring at the screen. This was what he was protecting. Not a crime. Not a scandal. An image. And suddenly, every insult made sense, every joke. Every attempt to shrink me so no one would measure him accurately. He didn't humiliate me because he was strong. He did it because he was terrified someone would look closely enough to see the truth. And now, I had. I closed my laptop and said nothing. Because knowing isn't power. Timing is. I didn't trust the first discovery. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt too neat. So I checked again. From a different angle. I spoke less and listened more. Asked questions that sounded casual. Let people talk past the point where they thought I'd lost interest. Details surfaced slowly. A former associate hesitated before answering. Someone else corrected themselves mid-sentence. Small things, but consistent. Every version of his story bent in the same places. I noticed how often others filled in gaps for him. How quickly assumptions replaced facts. His reputation had been carried more by repetition than proof. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. His name came up. Not with admiration, with confusion. I thought he was still there. No, he left earlier than that. Really? He said. The sentence trailed off. That was enough. I didn't need screenshots or confrontation. I needed certainty. And I had it. The image he'd built depended entirely on no one comparing notes. What struck me most was how fragile it all was. One honest question in the wrong room. One corrected assumption. One moment of silence where confidence used to carry the conversation. He'd built his authority on noise. I'd built mine on patience. And now the balance had shifted. He still spoke loudly. Still mocked. Still performed. But I heard something underneath it now. Urgency. I went back to being quiet, not because I was afraid, because I was ready. And when the moment came, it wouldn't look like revenge. It would look like the truth finally being allowed into the room. I didn't rush. That was the hardest part, doing nothing when every instinct wants resolution. I stopped reacting entirely. When he made his jokes, I smiled faintly and excused myself early. When he talked over me, I let the space stay awkward instead of filling it. Silence, I learned, makes people reveal more than arguments ever do. I also stopped warning anyone. Not my daughter. Not my husband. Not even myself. Once you tell someone too early, the story becomes emotional instead of factual. I didn't want outrage. I wanted inevitability. I watched how situations naturally positioned him, meetings he volunteered to lead. Stories he exaggerated just a little too much. Introductions where he leaned heavily on titles that weren't quite accurate. Each time, I noticed who nodded automatically, and who hesitated. I made sure I was present without being central. In rooms, but not in spotlights. Listening. Remembering. Letting contradictions stack quietly on top of each other. Time did most of the work for me. People changed jobs. Old contacts resurfaced. Conversations overlapped in ways he couldn't control. The narrative he relied on required constant maintenance, and he was starting to slip. What surprised me was how freeing it felt. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting to strike. I was waiting to not interfere. Because the truth didn't need my voice to be louder than his, it just needed space. And space, once given, has a way of rearranging everything. I didn't push. I didn't hint. I didn't warn anyone. I let time do what it always does when lies are involved, tighten. Family events kept happening. Birthdays, dinners, anniversaries. And he kept showing up exactly the same, loud, charming, confident. Still making jokes at my expense. Still enjoying the room when it laughed with him instead of at him. But the room had changed. I noticed it in the pauses. In the way conversations slowed when he started talking about his past accomplishments. How people nodded, but their eyes drifted. How follow-up questions didn't come anymore. My daughter mentioned, casually, that someone from his old network would be attending the next family gathering. A mutual contact. Someone who actually knew timelines. Names. Details. I said nothing. Just nodded. Just smiled. Then another coincidence. A family friend asked him for advice on something directly tied to the image he'd built, the role he claimed, the authority he insisted on. I watched him deflect. Speak vaguely. Change subjects. No one challenged him. But no one filled in the gaps either. That was new. The truth didn't need me to announce it. It needed proximity. It needed overlap. People who shared rooms and memories. I realized then that the setup wasn't something I engineered. It was something I allowed. All I had done was stop protecting him with my silence. I stopped absorbing the discomfort for everyone else, and once I did that, reality started arranging itself. He still thought he was in control. Still thought I was harmless. Still thought I was quiet because I was weak. In reality, I was quiet because the stage was being built without me lifting a finger. All I had to do now was wait for him to speak in the wrong room. It happened in the most ordinary way possible. No shouting. No dramatic reveal. Just a question asked by the wrong person. Someone new was there, a friend of a friend, connected to his industry. They listened politely as he launched into one of his usual stories, nodding at first, until their expression shifted. Slightly. Thoughtfully. "Oh," they said, gently. "I didn't realize you were still with them. I worked closely with that team after you left." The room didn't freeze. It tilted. He laughed. Too fast. "Yeah, well, you know how transitions are." I was still involved. The person frowned, not suspicious, genuinely confused. "That's odd. The restructuring happened months before that. Different leadership. Different direction entirely." Silence crept in, not sharp, but unmistakable. Others leaned forward. Someone asked a follow-up. Then another. Dates didn't line up. Titles blurred. Explanations tangled. For the first time, no one rushed to smooth it over. I watched his posture change. Shoulders stiff. Jaw tight. That easy dominance gone, replaced by calculation. He wasn't being attacked, he was being examined. And examination was something he'd never prepared for. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth didn't explode. It seeped. And seepage is impossible to stop once it starts. By the end of the evening, the jokes were gone. The laughter felt cautious. His voice, quieter. As we stood to leave, he didn't look at me. But I felt it. The moment he realized the room no longer belonged to him. The change was undeniable. At the next gathering, he spoke less. When he did, he checked reactions first. His jokes landed softer, sometimes not at all. The casual cruelty vanished, replaced by forced politeness. People asked him fewer questions. And when they did, they waited for real answers. I didn't say a word. But something subtle happened, others started addressing me differently. Asking my opinion. Listening. Not out of sympathy, out of recalibration. He noticed. The man who once enjoyed humiliating me now avoided eye contact. The arrogance that filled every room had cracks running through it. Not enough to destroy him publicly, but enough to change the balance. Power didn't move to me because I exposed him. It moved because everyone else stopped believing the version of him that required me to stay small. And for the first time in years, he knew it. He wasn't in control of the room anymore. And he never would be again. The fallout didn't arrive as an explosion. It came as a slow, irreversible collapse. Invitations stopped including him by default. Conversations shortened when he entered the room. People who once laughed too loudly at his jokes now smiled thinly, distracted, suddenly busy with their phones. No one confronted him outright, they didn't need to. The room had already decided. What surprised me most was how quickly the family rewrote its own memory. The same people who told me for years to ignore it now said things like, "I always thought something was off about him," or, "I never liked how he talked to you." Their discomfort wasn't about me. It was about being seen standing next to him when the mask slipped. He tried to regain control. Became louder for a while. Sharper. Then quieter. His jokes lost timing. His confidence cracked at the edges, replaced by defensiveness. He started explaining himself, a thing he'd never done before. My daughter noticed first. Not the secret itself, but the shift. She asked me one evening why he seemed so tense around me now. I didn't answer directly. I just said, people change when the truth gets close. The power dynamic had flipped without a single argument. I wasn't elevated. He was exposed, and the space he once filled with arrogance now felt empty, like a stage after the spotlight moves on. I used to think dignity meant swallowing discomfort to keep the peace. Staying quiet. Smiling through disrespect so no one else would feel awkward. I was wrong. Dignity is not silence for the sake of others. It's restraint for the sake of yourself. What changed everything wasn't exposure or confrontation. It was patience. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't rush the truth. I simply stopped absorbing what didn't belong to me, his arrogance, the family's excuses, the pressure to be the bigger person while being made smaller. People like him rely on reaction. On noise, on the belief that no one is paying attention closely enough to notice the gaps. The moment I stopped reacting and started observing, the power dynamic shifted, quietly, but permanently. When the truth surfaced, it didn't need my narration. It stood on its own. And when it did, I wasn't triumphant. I was calm. Because by then, I had already won something far more important than validation. I reclaimed my self-respect. If you're being humiliated by someone who feels untouchable, know this: you don't need to fight louder. You don't need to explain yourself into exhaustion. Sometimes the strongest move is to wait, watch, and let reality do what it always does: surface. Patience isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. And dignity, when protected long enough, becomes unshakable. Quiet justice doesn't announce itself. It arrives when it's ready, and changes everything.